In the middle of the 15th century, Europe was a continent fractured by ambitions, betrayals, and shifting alliances. But nowhere did suspicion run deeper than in the borderlands between Christian kingdoms and the rising Ottoman Empire. It was in this volatile frontier that Vlad III of Wallachia, later known as Vlad the Impaler, learned that the survival of a ruler depended not only on strength, but on the ability to detect treachery long before it struck. By the time Vlad reclaimed his throne in 1456, foreign envoys, merchants, and travelers moved freely across Wallachian borders. Many were legitimate emissaries seeking trade or political cooperation. Others, however, were something far more dangerous. Trained informants working for rival kingdoms and the Ottomans, embedding themselves within Vlad's court under the guise of diplomacy. And in a land where loyalty shifted as quickly as the seasons, the presence of such spies posed a direct threat not only to Vlad's rule, but to the very sovereignty of Wallachia. From the moment he ascended the throne, Vlad carried with him the memory of an earlier captivity under the Ottomans, a period during which he learned firsthand the methods of intimidation, manipulation, and psychological warfare. He returned to Wallachia with the conviction that his enemies operated in shadows, using subtlety rather than open confrontation. And in response, he would craft a rule that left no room for uncertainty. Early reports reaching the royal court suggested that foreign agents were moving among the boyars, buying information, or exploiting old rivalries. Intercepted letters hinted at coordinated efforts to map fortresses, bribe local commanders, and weaken the stability of Vlad's regime from the inside. These were not isolated acts. They formed a network, quiet, disciplined, and built to strike when least expected. At first, Vlad responded by tightening his personal guard and placing informants within the boyar elite. But as weeks passed, he became increasingly convinced that the threat was larger than any internal faction. More troubling were whispers that some visiting diplomats who claimed to represent foreign courts possessed detailed knowledge of Wallachia's defenses, knowledge no legitimate envoy should have obtained. To Vlad, this was not diplomacy. It was infiltration. Servants later recounted that the atmosphere inside the princely court began to shift. The halls grew quieter. Invitations to speak privately with the voivode, previously considered an honor, were now approached with dread. Vlad observed people with a sharper gaze, questioning inconsistencies, probing stories for cracks, and noting every gesture that betrayed discomfort. Even minor slips in protocol were investigated. And at the center of this growing tension was one unmistakable reality. Someone inside his court was feeding intelligence to his enemies. Vlad III was not a ruler who tolerated uncertainty. A lifetime of betrayal, from the boyars who murdered his father and brother, to the Ottoman captivity that reshaped his view of power, had taught him that hesitation was fatal. If there were spies within his domain, he would expose them, confront them, and ensure that their fate served as a warning to anyone who dared undermine Wallachia again. As foreign envoys continued to arrive, unaware of the storm forming around them, Vlad began assembling what he believed to be the first pieces of a vast conspiracy. What followed would transform his court from a place of diplomacy into a theater of psychological warfare, an arena where deception was answered with methods that Europe would remember in horror for centuries. And it all began with the quiet realization that the greatest danger to Wallachia was already inside its walls.
As Vlad III consolidated his rule in Wallachia, he found himself surrounded not only by open enemies, but by men who pretended to serve him. The fragile borders of the principality, wedged between Hungarian ambition and Ottoman expansion, made espionage an unavoidable element of political life. Every courtier could be a messenger, every foreign envoy a double agent, and every ally a potential traitor waiting for the right price. At first, the emperor tolerated it as part of the brutal game of Balkan politics. Messages passed through Transylvanian merchants. Information slipped into the hands of Ottoman envoys disguised as simple travelers. Noble families aligned themselves with whichever power promised their survival. Vlad understood this. He had grown up among the Ottomans as a political hostage. He knew better than anyone how surveillance and manipulation operated. But in late 1457, something shifted. Reports began arriving from scouts in the Danube Valley, describing unusual Ottoman troop movements, maneuvers far too coordinated for mere reconnaissance. They reflected knowledge of Wallachhia's weakest points, isolated fortresses, supply routes, noble estates with old grudges. Someone within Vlad's territory was feeding the Sultan's intelligence officers, and they were providing details no outsider could possibly know. Vlad reacted first in silence. He canceled council meetings without explanation. He dismissed servants who had attended him for years. He moved his personal quarters to a remote tower in Târgoviște, receiving only a handful of trusted men, none of whom dared to speak unless spoken to. Inside the court, tension thickened. Diplomats noticed that Vlad's gaze lingered on them a moment longer than usual, as if measuring the weight of their words. Local boyars whispered among themselves, terrified that the prince had discovered an act of treachery they had nothing to do with. Foreign envoys wrote letters describing a ruler who seemed to see betrayal even in the dust of the palace floors. They were only half wrong. Vlad wasn't imagining betrayal. He was tracing it. Secret interrogations began in the lower halls of the palace, questions delivered calmly at first, then escalating in intensity as Vlad cross-checked every scrap of testimony with hidden informants and captured Ottoman couriers. Slowly, a picture began to form. A small network of foreign spies operating at the heart of Wallachian power. They were men who had dined at Vlad's table, bowed before his throne, and pledged loyalty in the name of stability, while feeding his military secrets to the highest bidder. To Vlad, this was more than treason. It was the ultimate violation of honor, a stain on the authority he had bled to reclaim. By the end of the winter, Vlad had identified them all. But he did not act immediately. Instead, he watched. He let them continue their work, unaware that every message they passed was intercepted, unaware that the courier routes they relied on were already compromised, unaware that the prince had begun preparing a punishment so terrifying it would echo through European chronicles for centuries. The web was tightening, thread by thread, and Vlad, patient, calculating, and fueled by a lifetime shaped under the disciplines of Ottoman captivity, was about to pull it closed.
As winter settled over Wallachia, the network of foreign spies operating within Vlad's borders began to fracture under the weight of fear. Messages that once moved freely through merchant caravans and diplomatic envoys now vanished into silence. Couriers disappeared along forest roads. Informants stopped reporting. Every whisper suggested the same chilling truth. Vlad was hunting them, one by one. Inside the princely court at Târgoviște, the atmosphere grew increasingly suffocating. Officials loyal to Vlad noted subtle changes in his routine. The prince slept little, pacing long hours in candlelit chambers filled with maps, sealed letters, and captured sigils from enemy courts. Rage and calculation fused into something colder than vengeance, an obsession with eliminating every foreign agent who had played a role in the betrayal. The spies themselves did not yet know how deeply compromised they were. Their codes had been broken, their contacts turned, their safe houses mapped and marked. Some tried to flee toward the Danube, hoping to escape under Ottoman protection. Others sought refuge within the estates of boyars, believing political rivals would shield them. But Vlad anticipated every move. Riders loyal to the prince intercepted escape attempts, and interrogations revealed additional traitors embedded deeper within Wallachian society. As panic spread among the remaining spies, they began turning against each other. Accusations erupted in secret meetings. Men who once shared confidences now carried daggers inside their sleeves. Vlad had engineered precisely this effect: psychological collapse before physical capture. Meanwhile, the prince ordered the creation of a special detachment drawn from his most disciplined soldiers, men trained not simply for combat, but for the extraction of intelligence through fear, pressure, and ruthless precision. Their task was not immediate execution. Not yet. First, they were to unravel every network, expose every handler, and deliver every captured spy to the same hidden fortress where Vlad intended to make an example that Europe would never forget. By the end of the season, Wallachia was transformed into a landscape of suspicion. Smoke from distant watchfires drifted over the frozen hills. The forests, once silent, now carried the echoes of pursuit. Hooves beating through snow, steel flashing between trees, shouts swallowed by the wind. This was no longer a hunt. It was the tightening of a noose, one woven from betrayal, retribution, and the cold logic of a ruler determined to show Europe what happened to those who dared to undermine him.
When Vlad returned to power, the map of loyalty around him was fractured. Warlords, boyars, merchants, and foreigners moved through Wallachia, carrying information, rumors, and promises. In a border principality sandwiched between empires, where allegiances shifted with seasons and fortunes, intelligence was a currency. Vlad understood that controlling information, discovering who betrayed him, and making examples of them was as effective as any fortified wall. The first rule of his campaign was straightforward: spies would not remain anonymous. Networks of informants, agents placed by Ottoman commanders, by Hungarian courtiers, even by local nobles, could tip the balance of power overnight. The second rule was far more brutal. Once identified, a spy's fate was not merely execution, it was spectacle. Contemporary chronicles, diplomatic letters, and later pamphlets converge on the same pattern. Spies were seized not in secret cells, but often in public spaces, marketplaces, taverns, or at border crossings. The capture was a demonstration, an announcement that intelligence operations were being watched, and that betrayal carried a public cost. Interrogation followed, methodical and deliberate. Vlad employed both physical coercion and calculated performance. He pressed men until they spoke, and then he staged their confession for others to see. But confession alone was insufficient. For Vlad, the deterrent had to be visual and durable. The treatment of captured informants was engineered to spread terror through the most efficient medium available: rumor, amplified by sight. Some were executed immediately. Others were subjected to mutilations or punishments that left them alive long enough to be paraded back through towns as living warnings, crippled, humiliated, their broken bodies bearing the message that betrayal would not erase itself quietly. Examples recorded by chroniclers, some contemporaneous, others shaped later by propagandists, tell of spies returned to their masters in states that made negotiation impossible. Envoys and agents, sent with letters and covert instructions, were made into carriers of horror, mutilated in ways that carried symbolic weight, their wounds designed not only to punish but to shame, and to deliver a clear signal across borders.
A head preserved and displayed, a face disfigured, or a man given his freedom only to stagger home crippled and proclaim the price of deceit, all served the same function. They were walking proofs that Vlad's reach extended beyond battle lines. Vlad also used staging. Trials, if the word can be applied, were public theater. In the great hall or on the steps of a fortified gate, accused informants were presented, their alleged crimes read out loud in a voice meant to be heard by soldiers and peasants alike. Testimony, coerced or otherwise, was reenacted. The act of adjudication was as much a lesson as a punishment. Loyalty was enforceable. Treachery would be memorialized as shame. There was a strategic logic beneath the cruelty. Spies operate on the assumption of plausible deniability. They depend on networks that can hide them. By converting a hidden agent into a public spectacle, by turning secrecy into spectacle, Vlad made intelligence work far more hazardous. Commanders who considered placing informants anywhere in his domain had to calculate the visibility of the consequences. That calculation saved lives on the battlefield. Armies demoralized by fear are less effective, supply lines become suspect, and an opponent's ability to coordinate collapses when his own ears and eyes are unreliable. Yet the method had costs. Psychological warfare of this kind consumes the society that employs it. Fear is contagious. It corrodes trust among allies, and in the long term erodes the very networks a ruler needs to govern. Allied nobles grew suspicious of one another, merchants hesitated to travel, and foreign diplomats began to treat Wallachia as a place where agreements could be violated without recourse. That isolation, historians argue, contributed to Vlad's political vulnerability even after his greatest victories. More chillingly, Vlad's approach combined a bureaucratic precision with a symbolic grammar. Different punishments implied different messages. A spy from a foreign power might be displayed as a caution to rulers abroad. A local traitor might be punished so that peers would understand the personal cost of disloyalty. The staging was deliberate. Public executions, mutilations, or the stripping of rank were all calibrated to communicate to an audience that ranged from illiterate peasants to foreign courts. Survivors' accounts and foreign reports, often written by envoys who had to explain these horrors to their own sovereigns, describe how the psychological impact was disproportionate to Wallachia size. An empire like the Ottoman state, used to frontal assaults and massed armies, found itself confronting an opponent who weaponized spectacle and fear. The result was operational. Armies slowed, supply lines wavered, and the calculus of invasion changed. That tactical effectiveness, however, was a double-edged sword. It won invasions, yet made reconciliation more difficult and alliances less stable. By the time word of Vlad's methods had circulated across Europe, it had already become both legend and policy. Foreign spies no longer traveled with the same ease. Envoys demanded guarantees, and Europe's courts debated whether such methods were warfare or criminality. For Vlad, the immediate returns were clear. Betrayal was costly in ways that commanders and courtiers could not ignore. For Wallachia, the long-term price would be an escalating cycle of mistrust and isolation that shaped the principality's fate long after the stakes were removed.
By the time the campaign against the Spies reached its apex, Vlad's methods had stopped being merely tactical and had become a system. The impalements, the public mutilations, the orchestrated humiliations, all of it functioned as a single, coherent instrument designed to do one thing: break resistance before it could organize. Spies, traitors, and suspected collaborators were not simply punished. They were turned into messages, living monuments of what happened to those who crossed the Prince of Wallachia. This calculated escalation carried consequences that extended far beyond Wallachia's borders. News of Vlad's reprisals moved faster than armies. Merchant ships, travelers, ambassadors, they became carriers of a brand of terror that shocked courts from Buda to Constantinople. For many in Europe, the initial reports were almost unbelievable.
an Eastern ruler who used cruelty not as sporadic revenge, but as a deliberate instrument of statecraft. In diplomatic salons and monarchs' chambers, ministers debated, had Vlad defended Christendom or had he abandoned civilized limits? The answer depended on perspective. In the short term, Vlad's strategy worked. The Ottoman invasion faltered, supply lines were strangled, morale collapsed. Spies no longer dared move freely. Whole networks of informants were disrupted. And the image of a ruler willing to inflict the most public spectacles of suffering discouraged conspirators among Walachia's boyars. Order, of a kind, returned. Yet the very instruments that produced that order also sowed the seeds of political instability. Allies recoiled. Courts that had once praised his defense against the Sultan began to whisper about a man they could not endorse. Hungarian nobles who supplied troops found themselves embarrassed when their banners flew over fields of impaled prisoners. The Pope praised the defense of Christendom in public statements, but behind closed doors, envoys phrased questions more carefully. Legitimacy had a moral dimension that Vlad's terror undermined. Inside Wallachia, the social fabric changed. Brutal punishment concentrated power in the prince's hands, but at the cost of civic trust. Merchants, craftsmen, rural leaders learned to obey less out of loyalty than out of calculated fear. This kind of coercion is brittle. It produces compliance while corroding the bonds that sustain long-term governance. Where institutions depend on reciprocal obligations, terror substitutes a one-way imperative: obey or die. Politically, the backlash manifested quickly. Radu, Vlad's brother, emerged as an alternative. Backed by Ottoman money and a faction of Wallachian nobility tired of living under a reign of spectacle, he returned as a counterweight. Foreign patrons who once protected Vlad's claim now calculated risk differently. If your allies' tactics make you vulnerable to reputational collapse, the cost of continued support rises. States are pragmatic. They will shelter a hero so long as his heroism does not threaten broader stability. Vlad's fall, then, did not come solely from the swords of enemies. It came from the same machine of terror that had secured his victories. Allies abandoned him, internal conspiracies multiplied, and an exhausted polity could no longer supply the manpower and resources required to sustain a leader who had turned the rules of war into permanent spectacle. He fled, was captured, released, and finally died in the fog of battle and betrayal, a violent end befitting a life conducted on the fringes of mercy. Yet death did not silence the reputation. Reports of his cruelty hardened into stories, pamphlets, and woodcuts that traveled across Europe. To some, he was a national savior. To others, a monstrous exemplar of what power untethered from restraint can become. Bram Stoker's later borrowing of his name for Dracula owes less to vampire lore and more to the cultural aftershocks of a prince who blurred the line between political actor and theatrical horror. The most troubling legacy, however, is not the biography of a single man, but the lesson his career taught future rulers. Vlad proved that terror, when administered methodically, can substitute for military strength. He showed how spectacle and psychological manipulation can multiply a state's influence beyond its logistical capacity. That lesson proved seductive. Subsequent rulers in different regions and eras studied the performative aspects of power. Public punishments staged as cautionary displays, humiliation as politics, fear as administration. That is the real danger that lingers in history. It is easier to dismiss Vlad as a barbarian than to face the uncomfortable truth. His successes were, in part, dependent on rational calculations of harm and display. The instruments of cruelty were not random. They were engineered. Once engineered, they become a technology of power. So what should we remember? First, that short-term triumph achieved through terror often produces long-term fragility. Second, that the moral cost of victory matters in diplomacy and governance. And finally, that historical narratives have a responsibility to hold complexity. Acknowledging the military effectiveness of Vlad's measures does not absolve the human suffering inflicted for those outcomes. When scholars sift the chronicles, military letters, and pamphlets, they find more than a lurid tale. They find a study in the mechanics of coercion, how fear can be planned, staged, and weaponized. And in that study is a warning for the present. Techniques that dehumanize, once adopted, are difficult to confine to a single ruler or a single campaign. In the end, Vlad's forest of stakes did more than repel an army. It changed how governments understood power's optics. It proved that the theater of pain can alter political calculations. That proof would echo through the courts and battlefields of Europe for centuries. And for that reason, the story of Vlad the Impaler remains less a sensational anecdote and more a grim chapter in the history of political violence.